This is Kathy Deaton from Fan the Flame Ministries sharing with you nuggets of godly wisdom. This episode is titled, What Does Dying to Self Really Mean? I'd like to read a quote from George Mueller. There was a day when I died, utterly died to George Mueller, his opinions, preferences, taste, and will. Died to the world, its approval or censure. Died to the approval or blame even of my brethren and friends. And since then, I have only to show myself approved to God. George Mueller was used by God in a mighty way in England. There were many orphan children who roamed the streets causing trouble. They were hungry, dirty, and needed love and attention. God placed a burden on Mueller's heart to do something about this dire situation. A whole generation of children was being lost to Satan because they didn't have mentors to give them the right instruction. But instead of talking himself out of this momentous task by saying, somebody needs to do something about these children, but I don't have the learning or the resources to make a difference. Instead of doing that, he responded to the calling of God and just said, okay, God, I'll do it. He started. He knew that God would have to intervene or it would be an impossible task. I mean, how could he possibly care for all those children on a long-term basis without God's help? He couldn't. God led him to open an orphanage, and he decided that if God had truly called him to do this impossible task, he could be depended upon to completely provide the finances to do it. What a step of faith! He depended upon God instead of man. And God would not only have to provide for his needs, but for many hungry children who would be depending on him to provide for their needs. But God did supply the needs for not only one orphanage, but for many of them, as George Mueller walked in obedience day after day. Over his lifetime, he mentored thousands of orphan children and gave them a hope for a bright future. God used one man who would walk in obedience to change the future for thousands of children. And there is no doubt that the city and surrounding areas changed for the better as well. A whole generation of children now had hope for the future instead of hopelessness. As I read this quote, it brought to memory how I had battled with this particular thing several years ago. I used to think of dying to self and what it would mean in my life. I truly wanted God to have total control and walk in obedience to what he desired. But dying to self was something I tried to accomplish in my own power. Then when I messed up, I would berate myself and think that I would never be able to do this thing that George Mueller had done that so powerfully and radically changed his life. But I finally realized that dying to self means that you want God to have control over everything in your life more than you want to control it yourself. The first step is to learn to hear the Holy Spirit when he speaks and just be obedient to what he says. He will never lead you astray and always desires the very best for your life. If you wake up each day and your main desire is to allow the Holy Spirit to work in the way God desires, you will be changed from the inside out. You're now allowing the Holy Spirit to change you instead of you trying to do it yourself. This means God will do some deep cleaning with the sole purpose of making your life one that reflects his. And truly, I have found that the Holy Spirit does an excellent job of showing me things that need to change. And even though it usually feels terrible at the time, I've found that God is simply transforming my life into one that will reflect his. When you can look at things in this way, you can also look at trials in a completely different way. Being dead to self is a life that reflects God, but it starts with learning to hear the Holy Spirit and choosing to walk in obedience to what He says. It's really that simple. You don't have to do it. You just allow the Holy Spirit to work through you to accomplish what God desires. I think George Mueller had come to the point that being in the will of God was the only thing that mattered. When he could do that day after day after day, he realized that he had become dead to self. It was just the natural outcome of a life that walked in sync with God. Fear of man must die in our life, for if the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, the fear of man is the beginning of misery, compromise, and disappointment. This is Kathy Deaton from Fan the Flame Ministries sharing with you nuggets of godly wisdom. Please check out my blog at whogodis.com and sign up for my monthly newsletter. I've also written a handbook for victorious Christian living, which gives practical ways to learn to hear the Holy Spirit and get grounded in the foundations of the Christian faith. You really can make a difference for God. I would also love to interact with you on social media, and you can sign up for podcasts in the iTunes store. Thank you so much for listening, and may God richly bless you as you seek to follow Him.